those that don't know you, let's fill in the gaps. Let's hear the Mark Talbot story. I mean, we know that you're a professor and an author. You teach philosophy, and you have written about suffering, which we're going to get to in a moment. But let's hear a little bit about your story. As you've already alluded, you broke your back when you were 17, but a little bit about where you grew up and how you got to where you're at today.
Spent my first 7 years in Warren, Ohio. My dad was a mechanical engineer. He was, at that point, hired by Boeing out in Seattle. Boeing was expanding quite a lot back in those years. He was an expert with regard to welding, and they were trying to figure out if they could weld the skin onto an airplane instead of riveted on, because it would be immensely lighter. Turned out they've never been able to do that, or at least they weren't during the time that he was there. We moved to Edmonds, Washington. We lived 500 feet from Puget Sound. We had to head across just one lot, a vacant lot, over the railroad tracks, which ran along Puget Sound there, and had what was more or less a private beach because nobody else could get to it. Of course, the beach can't be private, it's public property, but we were the only ones who basically could get to it, the people in the neighborhood. We had a creek that ran down the lot beside us that had fingerling, fish and rainbow trout, and then a wood that was behind us. It was an idyllic life. I was, how should we put it? I was precocious but not disciplined, and was capable of doing really rather original thinking. I won a big science fair award when I was in junior high on acceleration versus pregnancy, which was about oviviviparous, viviparous, and oviparous animals and what happened if you sent them up in model rockets with regard to what happened to their gestation. And so I was capable of doing some pretty significant work, but I never learned any discipline. I raced go-karts and quarter midgets and loved the adrenaline rush that came with doing things like that. What it more or less came to before I had my accident right at the end of my junior year in high school was that I realized that I was in really serious trouble, Travis. And the trouble was that I was a year away from going to college. And I knew that I wouldn't have any problem getting into the University of Washington. In fact, I'd done some research down there already with some professors, but I was quite sure that I wouldn't be able to get through even a year of college because I'd be too undisciplined. I was worried about the aspects of my life that involved just doing reckless, dangerous things, such as driving down back roads at breakneck speeds, just because I enjoyed that sort of stuff. And so at the end of my junior year, I found myself thinking that my life was going to, in fact, be a major failure. And that was when I had this accident. A friend of mine and me had built this, and I had built this rope swing. We built a crossbow so that we could shoot a piece of twine through a tree that was far out over a bank. Pulled the twine through, pulled thicker and thicker ropes through until we had a 2-inch thick rope, hooked up this rope swing where you started from 10 feet up on a platform on a tree. There was about 10 feet of dirt below that, and then there was a cliff that dropped off. The thing was exceedingly fast. We had a round seat on it, and if you didn't land on the seat, you couldn't hang on. It went so fast. And I just enjoyed the thrill of riding that thing. I would, it had a very long arc. I would, in fact, hold myself off the seat until I got out to the far end with my feet over my head, and then hit the seat and come back spinning. The first time you couldn't get off because you were too close to the tree. The second time you had to, because if you had waited, then when the rope would hesitate, it would have been about a 30-foot drop. Well, there came a point where I had jumped on as a third person, one person on the rope, a second person over that person, a third person jumped on the first time back. I had been the only one who had done it. And I had a younger friend who was 15, who was a great athlete, and he said, I'd like to try that. And so one evening, right before twilight, I said, okay, that's all right. So I was on the seat. My older friend was straddled me, and we came back, and our younger friend hesitated, didn't jump until the rope had more or less stopped. So it meant it was moving away from him by the time he reached me. I was holding on to him with one hand, holding onto the rope with the other. We got out to the far side of the arc, and I realized that he and I were going to fall. And the only thing I thought was, if I fall on him, I'll kill him. So I shoved him off one way, and it turned out that that meant that I was peeled off, and my shoulders hit first, and my feet went over my head. It was twilight. It was just starting to head toward darkness. He had slid in the mud where this little creek was. I was holding him down because I knew he had to be hurt. I think it was about 50 feet. It's hard to tell exactly what the distance was. Once I had him slowed down, I looked and I saw that my legs were in this creek and I wasn't feeling anything. And I knew immediately that I had broken my back. There was a fellow called Brian Sternberg, who in the early 1960s had pioneered fiberglass poles for the pole vault at the University of Washington. He was on Life magazine cover for a couple of times and had the world pole vault record at that point. Brian had been practicing his landings on a trampoline, had lost his orientation one time and had broken his neck and was a quadriplegic. And I had met Brian and knew immediately that I had done basically the same thing to myself lower down on my back than he had done higher up. Here's the interesting thing. I immediately felt God's love for me, and that this was in fact a blessing to me. And it was tied to the way that I had felt my life was going to head in a really disastrous way forward if it went on the way that it had been going on. More or less what happened was that as I hit the ground and realized what had happened to me, all of the distractions of life fell away. And I began to realize I'm going to have to be serious about life. I'm going to have to work at this business of being an appropriate human being. I spent 6 months in the hospital, and when I got out, I was walking with 1 to 2 canes, went to college a year and 3 months later, and it really was a blessing. One thing that I've found over the years, since of course there are things that constantly go wrong with anybody who's paraplegic, is that chronic suffering leads one to acknowledge one's need for God and one's dependence upon God. And so every day when I'm dealing with the sorts of things that I deal with, I find myself in constant prayer to God, and have ever since the accident. And that is a tremendous blessing. Ultimately, the only thing that is going to satisfy us is being in personal communion with the God of the universe, particularly in his Son. And what my accident started to do for me immediately and has done ever since is it put me in that kind of personal communion and holds me there.
And so your parents then were Christians?
They had become Christians after we went out to Seattle, and I had become a Christian when I was 12 because I was frightened by some things that I was doing. But it didn't take deeply. I mean, I was in church, I was in Sunday school, I was even at times preaching because I was precocious enough that they'd occasionally let me preach when I was 15 or 16 years old. But that was an aspect of my life. It wasn't integral to my life in the way that my relationship with God became after the accident.